The story that I'm going to tell you starts not with the soldier, but with his great-grandfather, Joseph Foster. He was born in 1626 in England and was an immigrant to the British colonies in 1651. His son was Robert Foster. He owned a plantation near what is now Manassas, Virginia. These records are difficult to authenticate because there were 4 Robert Fosters who arrived in the colonies during the immigration wave in the 1600s. Plus, each Foster sibling generation repeatedly named their sons Robert. And many historical records were burned during the Civil War. So we can't get those records either. I relied on 2 books called The Seedlings of William Foster. It was written by Flavius Morton Foster, who conducted the original research by using inherited documents, old family Bibles, interviews with relatives, and letters. And it was authenticated and updated by his cousin, Andrea Foster Potter, in 210. Her research is available on Ancestry, Family Search, and other websites. I wrote to Miss Foster expressing my gratitude for her extensive research, and I have her permission to include her work in this profile, assuring that it will not be published outside of this family. And there's one more thing I have to talk about. It's hard to accept that our ancestors, the Virginia Fosters, were enslavers. Their plantations survived because of the work of the humans that they bought and sold. The genealogist's creed is that we do not judge what we find, we only record. We acknowledge that their time and their culture were different, and we're grateful that it is not our time and our culture. That said, by the mid-1700s, George Foster inherited the plantation, which had gone deeply into debt. In the mid-1700s, small plantation owners became increasingly squeezed by the British merchant brokers, who controlled the prices of all imported materials and supplies that the plantation owners needed to raise their crops. And then the brokers also controlled the prices for all of the crops and the shipping that the owners needed to sell to Britain. Additional problems for the plantation owners included declining tobacco prices, higher transportation costs, and soil exhaustion from repeated planting of the same crop. Unable to pay his bills, George was forced to mortgage his land. He continually made payments until he cut his debt in half. But when he died from smallpox in 1788, he still owed more than the land was worth. And that brings us to his son and our soldier, William Peyton Foster. During this time, the American colonists were rebelling against the taxes and the laws and the strangleholds that were imposed by Britain. When the war was declared, William, along with his neighbors, decided to join in the rebellion. He joined Colonel Charles Harrelson's company of artillery, a Virginia bombardier militia. I read that they marched from Prince William County, Virginia, to Trenton, New Jersey. And I wondered, that's a long way. How far do you march? And what do you carry? What do soldiers carry when they march? And how far do they go? So I have this map that kind of shows you. I'll pass it around so you can see it better. But they started in Virginia. They marched all the way up to Trenton, New Jersey with their backpacks. And they went to New Jersey because the British was trying to decimate the American soldiers, the American army. And they did that by sending in people that had smallpox. And they sent them blankets that were infected with smallpox.
Oh.
And Washington decided that all of his soldiers were going to be inoculated against smallpox. And it was a very controversial rule. So I'm going to pass this around that you can see where William had to
You
march.
read about that.
They marched everywhere. I wondered how far the soldiers marched every day. And the answer is about 14 miles on average, unless they were going to a battle, and then they would up the miles to maybe 20 or 25 to get to where they needed to go. And in their backpacks, they carried blankets, extra uniforms, cooking utensils, food rations, riding materials, tobacco, and weapon maintenance tools. Usually when the army was traveling, they would have big wagons pulled by oxen that would have the army equipment that they needed. From Trenton, they marched to Valley Forge. And we've heard a lot of stories about the hardships of Valley Forge in that winter. And we will hear more as the talk of the revolution is going on. The men built small log cabins to live in, but they lacked warm clothing. Many of the soldiers wore their shoes out while they were marching, and they had none to wear in the snow. Over 1,000 men died that winter of hypothermia or frostbite. And Martha Washington ordered that all the army wives knit or sewed clothes for the soldiers. George Washington begged and threatened Congress to send supplies, telling them that he would have to disband the army. And the Congress really didn't have any money to send because they didn't have any way of financing, because each state had their own method of raising funds, and none of it was going to the Congress because they were not united yet. At one point, the army had only enough food for 3 days. And greedy area farmers refused to sell food to the troops, hoping to get better prices from the British. And in addition, the officers in charge of acquisitions were ill-trained and inexperienced. Washington sent troops to forage as far away as Buck, Pennsylvania, Delaware, and New Jersey. But by early spring, things began to improve. Washington appointed General Nathaniel Greene as a quartermaster, and he organized efficient methods to bring supplies into the camp. One of the positives of the winter encampment at Valley Forge was that General Washington appointed General Frederick von Steuben, a German volunteer, to train men to be an army. He gathered the leaders of each unit and taught them to drill, march, quickly load and fire their guns, and followed orders. These leaders, in turn, went back to train their own units. And the result was, by spring, finally, a united fighting force was trained to meet the British. For 3.5 years, our soldier William served in the Continental Army under General Washington. Sometimes during these years, he received 3 bullet wounds in his right arm that made it useless. And when his enlistment time was up, William walked home, back to Virginia. But it was not a good homecoming. When William arrived home, he found that his father had died with his farm heavily in debt, and it now became William's farm. William spent 4 or 5 months sorting things out and letting his arm heal. And then he re-enlisted, and he marched back to join the Continental Army, and he left his wife, Sally, pregnant again. As a bombardier, William was in many significant battles, and it would take you too much time to tell you about them here. But when you study the Revolution, you will recognize these generals that William Foster fought under. General George Washington, General Nathaniel Greene, and General Henry Knox. And here are some of the cannons that William probably used. The top one was a siege cannon. They fired solid shots, and they were used to destroy the fortifications and buildings. The howitzer fired both bombs and cannonballs in a flat rate, but it was really a high trajectory. The mortar fired an exploding shell that would fly over the earthworks while still airborne, and then it would rain shrapnel all over the enemy. And then the bottom picture shows you how they used these cannons. There were usually about 6 soldiers for each cannon. So I will send that around.
I'll get one.
After 6.5 long years of fighting, William, with his mangled arm, was discharged in 1783, and he finally went home. But again, it was not the homecoming that he had hoped for. When his father died, William inherited 100 acres of heavily mortared land. But Sally had died, and their neighbor had gained control of the farm. The children had been given to William's mother to raise. So when he finally returned from the war, William found that besides losing the use of his arm, he had lost his father, his wife, his children, and his farm. Little is known about how William managed after he returned from the war. But eventually he married again. Her name was Sally Hart. The newly formed government had no money to pay back the soldiers, so it gave out land grants to the west, stretches of western land in Kentucky that it wanted settled. So in 1784, William and his best friend, Timothy Peyton, decided to move with their families to the free land. William's son, Harrison, went with his father and Sally, but his daughter, Latrice, was left in Virginia to raise the younger children. Now, it sounds good that you can just move to Kentucky. However, this is what they had to go through. This is the Appalachian Mountains.
Yeah.
And only 10 years before, Daniel Boone had cut a narrow trail through through these mountains. And it was only wide enough for a horse. It was very dangerous because of the rocks, the steep slopes. And the Indians, of course, did not want them to go through. And there were robbers. So I'll pass this around so you can see how difficult it was for them to get through. The group reached William Thomas Station in Kentucky. And it was called a station, but it was basically a large log cabin with a fortification around it. They all lived together because it was dangerous because of the Indians. So everybody would stay together in this big log cabin at night, and then at night, in the daytime, the men would go out and farm their land. They eventually moved, and Timothy Peyton built his own station, so William, Sarah, and Harrison moved to join them. Sarah's first child, Mildred, was born there. But unfortunately, one day when he was farming, William Peyton was attacked and killed by the Indians. And William was the one who organized the party to rescue his best friend's body. About 1811, William and Sarah moved again to Clark County, Kentucky, and that's in the northern part of Kentucky. They bought 100 acres of land and started farming. And despite all of his early hardships, William became a successful farmer. In 1819, he applied for and received a $96 pension for his military service. A year later, it was rejected because his income was too high. He died when he was 77, and he died from diabetes. And he's buried on a Lupin Creek in Clark Country. Sarah later married Moses Baker, and he died after about 10 years. So then she applied for a widow's benefit for William. And she has a very extensive and interesting file on the National Archives of her applying for this pension. As we study the Revolution, we have the advantage of knowing the outcome. We know that we won. But William did not know that. What William did know was that he might not survive the diseases, the starvation, the lack of clothing, and the defeats by superior British forces in battle after battle. What William did know was if his army lost, he could have been hanged, his land confiscated, and his family dispersed. Have any of us faced consequences like that? And would we make the same choices? Next year we will celebrate the 250th anniversary of our country's birth. We cannot acknowledge all of the brave people who made it happen, but we can remember and honor one of them, William Peyton Foster. This piece comes from the Foster family history that I just finished. Why is it important to us? Oops, missed my last page. Why is it important to us? Well, because William's father was George Washington Foster. George gathered up his family and with some of his brothers and sisters. They had a covered wagon that went from Kentucky to Illinois, and they were pioneers in the Springfield, Illinois area. George Washington Foster was a sergeant in a militia that went to western Illinois, and the Indians were trying, let me back up. Settlers were not supposed to cross the Mississippi into Iowa, but they were. So the Indians were pushing the settlers back. So the Illinois government decided to form a militia, and so to push the Indians back across the river. And it was called the Black Hawk War. And so George Washington, who was William's son, decided to join that militia, and he was a sergeant. And Abraham Lincoln was a lieutenant. They actually did not fight because the American militia ran away when the Indians threatened them, and it was finally settled by decree. George Washington's son was Leonard. Leonard was killed in a railroad accident in Illinois. I've looked and looked and looked for a newspaper account of it, but I've not found that. But he's buried in Illinois, and Gary and Marlene and I have taken pictures of that, that cemetery. But Leonard's daughter was Mary Olive Foster. Mary Olive Foster moved to Geneva, Nebraska, and she married Abraham Miller.
She's the one that
And her children were Vanetta, Ross, Ines, and Helen. And their children were Margaret Marcus, Pauline Olson, Marion Fisher. And their children were Matthew, Larry, Lucy, John, Gary, Nancy, and Mark.
And Lindsay.
And Lindsay, thank you.
You have to show off to be counted.
And some of their children were Colin, Eric, Andrew, Paula, Pamela, Nels, Luke. And some of their children, well, let's see. There's Alan, there's Catherine, there's Micah, there's Aiden, there's Alex, there's Adam, there's Freya, there's Nels, and Anna. We are a family, and we go back a long, long